It's great to come to you once again this week. I guess that if we had to find a title for this week's reflection, I would call it Moving Forward. Moving Forward. At least myself, and I'm sure you would agree, I've been feeling a little bit stuck these past few months, not quite sure where things are going, and trying to discern God's presence and God's life in the midst of all that's going on around us. And it's what we ought to be doing, and as faithful people, of trying to find God's presence in the moment. And that's what we've been focusing on last couple of weeks, and trying to look at God's will a little bit, that creative, active presence of God, not necessarily producing something that He has in His mind in us, but taking a circumstance and bringing it to a better place. And that circumstance could be something positive or something challenging and negative. Regardless, in and through it all, God is working. I was struck today at Mass and realized that the gospel really points to the core of today's reflection. So before we get into some more words from Jean-Pierre de Caussade, I would like to just read a portion of that gospel to you today, because the image is very apropos. The gospel is from Luke, and in this, Jesus says to them, no one tears a piece from a new cloak to patch an old one. Otherwise, he will tear the new, and the piece from it will not match the old cloak. Likewise, no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be ruined. Rather, new wine must be poured into fresh wineskins. And no one who has been drinking old wine desires new, for he says, the old is good. Let's think about that for just a moment. The old is good. I think many of us are kind of feeling that way these days, that this new life that we're asked to lead right now, with wearing masks in public and watching the way we interact with folks, limiting the numbers of people who can gather, and all the rest that has to go into dealing with the pandemic that is before us. All of us are kind of longing, I think, for the old way. I was talking to a parent, was trying to get her daughter ready for kindergarten, a whole big thing in her daughter's life. And she was mourning the fact that her experience is going to be so different than any of her other children. And she felt really sad about that, and was actually grieving the fact that her daughter would not be able to have that similar experience of her other kids. And so we're all kind of there in that place where, what happened to our old life? The old was good, and now we have to live in this new way. And again, I've often said that in our little chats together, we don't know how long, and that makes it even harder because we don't see the end product. We don't see the end result. We're in this kind of evolving place. And so Jesus points to the fact that, spiritual life, the gospel, relationship with God is not something old. It's not restoring something that was. It's finding something new. Kind of like the whole idea of God's will unfolding into something new, God bringing us from one place to another. And so just as much as you wouldn't want to put a new piece of cloth on an old cloak, that Jesus wouldn't want us to do the same thing in our own lives. It's not just taking something today and replacing it with something that was. It's trying to find something creative and different and new. And that's kind of the place where I think we got to focus our attention a bit. If we're going to be spiritually successful with where we find ourselves during these challenging times. So let's move to Jean-Pierre today and see what he says, because he has some profound stuff to say about this. And for his time, really, really appropriate to where we find ourselves. He says, all you who thirst, and I think we all thirst. We wouldn't be listening to this podcast if we weren't looking for something. All you who thirst, learn that you have not far to go to find the spring of living waters. Not far to go. I think all of us think that we have this huge journey to make before we can even begin making headway. He tells us no. And in fact, Jesus is telling us the same thing. All you have to do is desire the new, to look for the refreshing, the different, the challenging, where God is acting to find what you're looking for. Well, Jean-Pierre is saying the same thing. He says, it springs forth quite close to you in the present moment. Present moment. Therefore, hurry to approach it. Right now, today, at this moment, as you're listening to this, your thirst can be quenched by the relationship that you can have with God. All we have to do is open ourselves to the fact that we're not here alone, that God's power, His presence, His love is causing us to be, is sustaining us in being, and bringing us where we need to be, where we can be, not where we were, but where we can be. And that once we begin to tap into the fact that that presence is with us, then we begin to understand that our thirst is also being quenched. And we're not as thirsty, we're not as parched, because that presence that I now am able to experience, that presence that I'm able to begin to touch a little bit, is there to satisfy that need. He goes on, why with the spring so near do you tire yourselves running after shallow brooks that only tease your thirst? Well, that's profound. Running after shallow brooks that only tease your thirst. And we do that. You know, we go after these things that we think are going to make us happy, bring us to a better place, make us more secure, even calm our fears and our anxieties. You know, we sometimes think if we find this little safe place, that everything is going to be okay, but it's not, you know, because it may be for a little bit, but then after a while, we're going to have to begin to deal with life again, begin to live life again. And how we do that is going to be determined now what we're bringing to it. And if we don't have the wherewithal to discover that we can quench our thirst in the present moment and discover God in the present moment, we're going to miss out on a whole bunch of stuff. He says they measure stingingly the water they give us, while only the spring itself is inexhaustible. If you wish to think right and talk like apostles, prophets, and saints, abandon yourselves, as they did, to God's inspiration. Okay, so here we go. Abandon yourself to God's inspiration. You know, any artist or anyone who has a creative spirit to them has to be inspired. You know, if you're going to paint, you have to be inspired to create something on a canvas. If you want to write, you have to be inspired in order to put words on a paper that have wisdom and make sense. Inspiration is how human beings discover their creative selves. It's how we tap into potential energy that's inside of us. It's how we begin to find our way through the world. What inspires us? What's inspiring you right now? Or are you inspired at all? See, I think we have to begin to realize that God's presence is here, inspiring us to do something, to be something, okay? He doesn't inspire us to face a dead end. He doesn't inspire us to find our way into a depressive mood. He inspires us to create and to give and to find life, love, hope, and joy. That's what He's inspiring us to do. But we have to figure out how to listen for that voice and what that means in the active sense of living our life. He goes on, love unknown. We think that your wonders are past and finished, and that all we can do is copy the ancient volumes and quote your words out of the past. And we do not see that your unceasing action is an infinite source of new thoughts, new sufferings, new works, new patriarchs, new prophets, new apostles, new saints, who have no need to copy each other's lives or writings, but only to live in perpetual self-surrender to our secret operations. Wow. And that's so true. We're always looking back. We can look back and we can see what God did, for example, in the life of the Israelites as they wandered through the desert. We can see what God did in the life of the disciples who followed Jesus. We can see what God did in the life of his own son as he faced his passion, his death on the cross. We can see what God did in the life of St. Francis of Assisi, St. Teresa of Calcutta, any number of saints and witnesses in the history of our faith can be pointed to, and we could see what God did in and through them. And we almost want to model that. We almost want to copy it. We take their writings and we read the wisdom that is happening on those pages, and they can inspire us. But even so, we miss the fact that something is happening in here. In here. We're not meant to be like them. We're not supposed to copy them. We're supposed to allow God to be God in us so that we can be inspired in our own way. We're not meant to be another St. Francis of Assisi. We're not meant to be a St. Teresa of Calcutta. We're not meant to be any of those things. We're meant to be who God made us to be here and now in this life. And so, what is that? What does that mean? For some of us, the order might be taller. For others, it's more simple. It can be in one direction or another. There's no carbon copy or way to cookie cutter an answer to that question. We all have to discern it, but the fact of the matter is we're all being inspired. And once we begin to understand that as soon as we begin to take our next breath, God is inspiring us for something. And maybe these new thoughts, new prophets, new patriarchs, new works are our way through these crazy times. Maybe it is that we have to leave some of the past behind. But is that necessarily a horrible thing? Maybe some of that stuff needs to be left behind. And maybe the challenge is to move forward in new creative ways. I think sometimes we back ourselves into thinking if we have to leave the past, we're leaving everything. That somehow God's going out with the mix too. That because we can't do things a certain way or life is unfolding in a way that is sometimes unfriendly, sometimes hurtful, sometimes crisis-orientated, that somehow God's not in all of that, and we've somehow been abandoned or skewed from God's presence because things are moving in a different fashion. It's not true. God is still working. God is still redeeming. God is still creating. God still wants to bring us to joy. We just have to figure out how. We like to speak of the first ages of the church, the times of the saints. Are not all times the effects of God's creation and action? The working of his divine will, including all moments, filling them, making them holy, and making them supernatural? Has there ever been a method of self-surrender to God's will that is not still practicable? Did the saints from the earliest ages have any other secret of holiness than that of becoming what God's will was seeking to make them? From moment to moment? I think back to St. Francis of Assisi. I don't think St. Francis of Assisi left his home with a game plan in mind. I don't think he said, I'm going to get up and I'm going to defy my parents, leave the house, and I'm going to create a religious order. I don't think it worked like that. I think St. Francis of Assisi listened to the depths of his heart, made the connections between what was happening in there, God, creation, people, gospel, all of those things, and went one step at a time where he felt he was being drawn and led. And that's how St. Francis of Assisi did what he did. Did he need the talents and the gifts? Yes, but those were part and parcel of what God placed in him. You see? So all of the goods were there, and St. Francis was able to listen and learn and then act based on that. And I'm sure in his life, and especially in the beginning, none of it made sense, and he was probably scared. And it was not an easy road by any stretch, but in putting one foot in front of the other, he was able to look and see and do what we know from him to this day, which was wonderful, sanctified blessings. And will this operation not continue, even to the end of time, to pour out its grace on those who give themselves unreservedly to it? We have to give ourselves to. We have to take that leap and trust. Get out of our cocoon, get out of our place and trust and let God create and recreate. Whether we're 2 years old, 10 years old, 25 years old, or 90 years old, the thing is the same. We need to allow God to work in and through us, bringing us to a different place. He says, yes, dear eternal love, love eternally fruitful and full of wonder. Yes, will of God. You are my book, my doctrine, my knowledge. The will of God is my book, my doctrine, my knowledge. In you are my thoughts, my words, my deeds, my crosses. It is not by consulting your other works that I can become what you would make me, but only by accepting you in all things, in that one royal way, that ancient way, the way of our ancestors, the way of self-surrender to your will. I will think like them, speak like them, be enlightened as they were. In this way I will imitate them, quote them, and copy them in everything, in the surrender to your holy word. Will, not in what the actuality is, but in the surrender. We copy, we imitate that disposition and that place, okay? So in and through all of this, thy will be done is probably one of the most important prayers that we can utter, because in there is the key that unlocks our relationship with God. But it also unlocks our relationship with ourselves, because it takes us out of this point of hopelessness, out of this point of despair, and places us in a more positive way. It convinces us and shows us that we're not alone, that God is with us. And isn't that really what faith is supposed to do? Faith isn't just some insurance policy for what happens to us in eternal life. Faith is what guides the path of our way now, that makes us different from someone who doesn't have it. So what makes us different from somebody who doesn't have faith? Well, it has to be this pursuit of joy, this need to connect with a power, with a source greater than ourselves, so that I can begin to live and share in the life and the love that is part of what God wants and desires for me. You see, we're living in this time of social, political, religious, even unrest. There's unrest all over the place. The pandemic has brought us to places that have affected our behavior, our activities, our public interactions, shopping, school, personal business, work. Everything has been influenced by this. There's not a person out there who can't tell you that what we've been through these last several months has really been a test of patience, of endurance, of health. People are on edge. You can see it when we're out. That people are really almost at the point sometimes of frustration where they've just about had enough. And so when people are tired and exhausted, they're thirsty. They're religiously thirsty. They need to be refreshed. And there comes the faith that we're looking for, to bring us back, to make us just calm down, to rest, to inhale and exhale and say, thy will be done, that I'm here, not alone, with God. We come to Mass, and our worship at Mass is so different. We have to be isolated. People are very concerned about their personal space. We can't sing. We got to be careful with our responses. We have to be careful when we receive Holy Communion. We have to be worried about so many things we never had to be worried about before. We wear masks, and people can't see the expression on our faces. Is that person smiling? Are they angry? Are they sad? Do they care whether I'm here? All of that is different these days. And so we're in this time of change, confusion, discomfort, disorder, the breakdown of what has been known as normal. Everything has changed, and it's all so challenging for sure, especially for those who might be a bit older, who've never had to endure anything like this. And when that is happening, when things are challenging, when they're disordered, when they're different, it's so hard to see God in those times. Just like that young mother who was talking about her daughter going to kindergarten. Her daughter, I am sure, will have a very wonderful experience of kindergarten, because she doesn't have that reference point that we're bringing to the experience. And so even though it's different, it doesn't make it a negative. But it's so hard to see God's presence when things are all over the place and in upheaval. It certainly is a lot easier to see God when things are well put together. But in the midst of all of this stuff, we have to somehow accept the craziness and stop doing battle with it. Because if we don't, we're never going to find any measure of peace. If we don't accept the craziness, the emptiness, the differentness, and have some faith that God is taking that stuff, even though it's difficult, and transforming it into something else. We may not know what that is. We may not know what that is. It's going to be hard to see that right now. But trust in the fact that He's doing it. He's doing it. He's not absent from it or expecting us to find another way to something else. He's taking that stuff. So when you come to Mass and you're feeling uncomfortable, for example, or you're feeling isolated, God can do something with that. You know, if you place yourselves in God's presence and remember that He is with you and helping you through that, you're going to have a very different experience than if you're there fighting it or mourning it. We can't see what it's happening, but it is. And the threads and impulses, okay, that we can find deep within when we allow ourselves to quiet ourselves a bit and look, always are going to lead us back to faith, hope, and love. And then joy. You see, that's going to be the byproduct. You're going to know whether this is really happening and being successful for you because you're going to begin to experience joy. You're going to wake up in the morning and you're going to say, all is well, and it's wonderful to be alive. And it's wonderful to be in God's presence. And prayer is what allows us to discover these things and these depths and these riches that go unnoticed to most eyes. There are so many voices that we're listening to, so many voices that are vying for our attention. You know, voices such as fear, panic, disillusionment, despair, violence, anger. If you listen to them, you hear them. You hear it all over the place. And it's easy to allow all of those voices to determine our actions, you know, to almost make us want to isolate, remove ourselves, recoil within, and escape because what is out there is so scary. But in that is also the voice of God, calling us to fidelity and to those three virtues, faith, hope, and love. We're definitely moving from the way we were doing things before to another. And part of me doubts whether we're ever going to go back fully to what we once had. And that's okay. That's okay. In many ways, we're experiencing the process of dying to old images, dying to old ways of doing things, dying to an old self. We need to allow ourselves to go through this mourning. We need to find ourselves, ourselves the space to feel what we're feeling, to be where we are. But we also have to allow ourselves to understand that we're not alone. And that as we grieve, and as we mourn, and as we work through all that life is bringing us, all the challenges that come our way, that God is bringing us to a better place, and we have to trust. We have to stop overreacting. We have to stop over-defending. We have to stop over-protesting. We have to stop being overly critical, and we have to stop being negative. As long as those things are present, we're going to be stuck. There will be victory, and you may be the new prophet that God is going to use to do it. The process has always been and will always be the same. God creates. In this life of creation, we are asked to suffer. In that suffering, we are asked to die. But we are also invited to resurrection, to recreation and to new life as the process continues to unfold and move on and move on. God will always be around. That's one constant for sure. We just need to understand that and trust it. Sorry for being so long this week, but I think the message is well worth hearing and one that we definitely need to embrace. God bless you.